speaking of, not being able to really read the crystal ball, changing regulation, uncertainties, I kind of wanted to touch base on the Endangered Species Act and really talk to Ryan about what's going on. Anything our clients should be made aware of?
Yes, so talking about litigation, which we brought up several times, the Endangered Species Act is a poster child of litigation. Public interest groups kind of trying to hold Department of the Interior accountable for listing statuses, and then some, I guess uncertainty is the word, or perceived unwillingness to move forward on listed species statuses. That's really what's interjected a lot of confusion into the Endangered Species Act. And so, for instance, one of the species on the tip of a lot of people's tongues are, tricolored bats, right? They're proposed as federally endangered. They were anticipated to be listed in September 2023. We're now in 2025, and we don't have any more clarity on that listing status that we did then. What's unfortunate about that species and many others is the regulatory framework to conform to the Endangered Species Act exists. The Department of the Interior and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has created the final tool documents to set the expectation of how to advance a project considering the species. But yet there's still no listing status, so there's no regulatory requirement or trigger to do so.
There's no teeth behind it, right?
It leaves folks in this really odd gray area. And so we've seen people react all the way from essentially treating the species as if they're listed to then also burying their head in the sand, like the proverbial ostrich, and not paying any attention to it. And so that
Is the ostrich on the ESA?
If it is, it's not going to be listed.
Yeah.
It's that changing, or it's that uncertainty from the regulatory perspective that makes the ESA really kind of volatile right now.
Is there a standard piece of advice you offer across the board, navigating this with clients?
Not to get too technical with it, but really what the Endangered Species Act boils down to is understanding what section of the Endangered Species Act applies to your project and how to mitigate that risk. So it's really Section 7 versus Section 10. Mm-hmm. And in a nutshell, for the audience that isn't familiar with that, is your project federal or is it a private action? That answering that one question drives all future questions and answers under the Endangered Species Act. And so for a long time, project proponents would try to find ways to not advance a project under a federal nexus, meaning to be under Section 10 as a private entity. That was a clearer regulatory path. However, with all these listing uncertainties now, in my experience, Section 7 is a more predictable regulatory framework. Sure. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing the opposite, where now project proponents are trying to find a federal hook. They're trying to see if they need a Clean Water Act permit. They're trying to use a federal grant. And so that's been an interesting kind of change of course over the last decade or so, is if they can federalize their projects, there's more predictability with navigating the Endangered Species Act versus as a private entity. And I think it all stems from some decision-making authority or inability from Department of Interior to move forward on some of these listing statuses.
At one point, it was easier to go through Section 7 for endangered species issues because it was a faster process.
Right.
Right? I don't know what with the Clean Water Act and everything else that's going on now. If there's probably not a clear way to hook in the federal government. In fact, the federal government doesn't want you to hook in with this at this point, right? They don't want to regulate it.